Hello everyone. Today we will be talking about Oracle's Cloud Access Security Broker cloud service. It's part of our cloud security portfolio and kind of rounds out the various security products that we have in our identity and security products suite. I'm part of the product management team. My name is Suresh Sridharan and I'm based here out of the Bay Area. Now, as part of the agenda today, what we will do is we'll talk about how do you secure a digital enterprise, the kind of the market need. What are we seeing from our customers? What are we seeing as customers in various organizations adopt the cloud? And we'll also give you an overview of what the Cloud Access Security Broker is from Oracle, the Oracle solution, and how you can use it to solve challenges around securing your infrastructure, SaaS, as well as securing data in the cloud. And obviously, we'll get into some of the aspects of integrating CASB into the other security investments you may have in the enterprise, and time permitting, we'll get into a demo. If you think about the broad enterprise, the digital enterprise, there are like 4 different entities that get, that are opposing forces, if you will, which kind of drive the need for securing a digital enterprise. The first is around information technology. The IT departments typically have to manage hundreds of cloud services. Each of those have their own configurations. There's required maintenance for each of these. And typically, you need some level of cloud service expertise. That's basically what the IT departments kind of face. Now, you shift over and you think about the information security team. They're more bothered about the identity of the users and the entities that are accessing the different applications, securing the data. They also are worried about the different threats that may be permeating the enterprise firewalls, if you will. And obviously, the Security Operations Center is definitely one of the nerve centers, if you will, in order to ensure that there's security around the enterprise. On the other hand, there's also the operations team, which is basically looking at, do we have the right configurations? How do we maintain these configurations? How do we ensure that we get right visibility into the different applications that are being used? And obviously, there's also the utilization of different applications and the capacity that they actually have and to scale accordingly. And finally, the fourth opposing force that you have is around governance. Audit and compliance never really goes away. Those teams really need to make sure that you're adhering to the different standards. It could be regulatory as it stands for different verticals. It could be general governance in terms of ensuring that everything is operating smoothly. And if you think of these broad forces, one of the key challenges people actually face is the ability to build expertise across all the different cloud services that are being adopted. These are still early days. About 15% of the enterprises actually adopt cloud services. But if any of these teams need to perform effectively, then they really need to go in and kind of build the expertise around each of these different cloud services. And as you can imagine, there are so many variations of these, right? Some of these are in the infrastructure space. Different departments may be adopting different cloud infrastructure. Same thing goes with platforms as well as SaaS applications. And the other thing is it takes a lot of time to understand each of these services, to look at the different resources provided by each of these services. And we'll talk a little bit about what I mean by resources and the different actions that people can actually take as part of these. Now, obviously, that kind of brings us into the shared responsibility model, and particularly in a heterogeneous cloud environment. If you think about it, the cloud kind of adheres to the shared responsibility model for security. There's the security of the cloud and there's the security in the cloud. However, these are kind of a bit confusing because each of these cloud services are provided by different vendors. The expectation of configurations that adhere to specific security needs are different across each of these application or infrastructure or platform providers in the cloud. And each department may assume its own set of cloud services, which means as a central global IT organization and an InfoSec organization, you still are responsible for the security of all these services. So broadly, if you think of the shared responsibility, there's the ability to provision and the automation and the orchestration of these services. Obviously, they need to be secure. There's the governance and managing the policies around these, the ability to monitor these applications, and obviously that kind of goes into utilization of capacity and security as well. Now, because these are so varied in terms of the services that are provided, you really need to have some level of automation in terms of the kind of tools that you use to monitor these cloud applications, to identify the sanctioned applications versus the stealth applications that people are using behind the scenes. And that's really where a CASB service like the Oracle CASB actually kicks in. what we do is we abstract the difficulty that you have or the knowledge that you need for each of these applications, these SaaS applications or PaaS applications or infrastructures that you may be using in the cloud. And we've built them out as policies or out-of-the-box smart policies, which basically give you a consistent security posture. So this kind of saves you hundreds of hours of effort in understanding each of these services, in making sure that these services adhere to the same security standards that you may have set for internal applications on premises as well. And given that these are heterogeneous cloud services, and there may be hundreds of them in use at any given point of time, it's extremely difficult for any organization to kind of manually monitor for threats and gain visibility. That's really where machine learning kind of kicks in. So a CASB service, like the Oracle CASB service, actually helps you secure your journey into the cloud, if you will, across infrastructure, platform, as well as SaaS applications. Now, as I mentioned, when you have hundreds of applications, thousands of users, and even with each of these applications, there could be multiple instances running in different departments, it becomes extremely difficult to have a manual process by which you can actually secure them. So that's really where machine learning comes in, there's automation comes in. So one of the things that the Oracle CASB service does is, as users actually utilize these different applications, we actually create a user's baseline behavior. And we'll talk a little bit more about it. This kind of helps in determining any anomalous activities and flagging off to the info security departments. Now, the really big advantage that you have here is that you really need to worry about the real incidents that are anomalous, as opposed to monitoring every single activity across every user and making sure that your infrastructure and your whole enterprise is secure. Now, as a vision, one of the things that we are looking at here at Oracle is building a comprehensive cloud access security broker, CASB solution, with the shortest time to deploy and the shortest time to value. So what do we mean by that? Let's kind of look at each of these components here little by little, by part. The first thing is we want to secure users in the cloud. These could be, whether it is irrespective of which location it's used in or which kind of entity you store your user identities in, we want to be able to use that as part of your security posture. We want to secure data in the cloud. We want to secure your infrastructure and platform in the cloud, and obviously the SaaS applications as well. Now, these could be SaaS applications that are from Oracle or from third parties, because no enterprise is basically looking at just one single vendor across all of these different applications and platforms. Most enterprises are heterogeneous in nature. And obviously, in order to get you the right kind of security posture and to get you the right insights and the actions that you want to get from all these different applications, we integrate both with Oracle applications on the cloud as well as with third-party applications. The third party could be different identity providers, it could be SIM vendors, it could be enterprise mobility management vendors, and the kind. And obviously, in order to make sure that the machine learning is effective, we actually look at threat intelligence that we get from multiple third parties to ensure that what we actually produce is not noise, but actually a lot of valuable data on which you can actually gain insights and take action. And obviously, when you look at gaining insights, what we mean is looking at anomaly detection, behavior analytics, as well as generally getting a visibility into which applications are being used and what users are doing on these different applications. In terms of actions, it could be securing the different pieces of data that is stored. It could be it could lead into compliance, and there could be remediation of access for different users, and could just generally be security alerts that you gain. Our strategy kind of focuses on being the best CASB in the market for multi-cloud infrastructure as a service. We thrive to be the best CASB to secure all of the cloud applications from Oracle. This spans across infrastructure, platform, as well as the SaaS applications, and provide comprehensive data security across structured and unstructured data. That's kind of what our strategy is. That's what we are executing on, and that's what we believe we'll be very successful at. So let's kind of look at each of these elements one after the other. Let's look at the first one being multi-cloud infrastructure as a service. Now, if you think about it, obviously, as with most of the cloud applications, you have the shared responsibility, challenges that customers actually face in the cloud, which is who's responsible for what aspects of the cloud, security of the cloud versus security in the cloud. There are going to be different compliance requirements. We'll walk through a couple of use cases around the compliance requirements. You obviously want to ensure that there's no data leakage, and you want to ensure that there's no misuse of admin privileges. These are the four broad challenges that customers have shared with us when they actually are looking at securing infrastructure as a service. Now, let's look at the shared responsibility model in a heterogeneous environment. Most organizations, in this case, Acme Corp basically has three broad departments that we're going to focus on. One is sales and marketing, the other is global IT, and R&D. And as you can imagine, like most organizations, each department tends to adopt its own infrastructure. For example, you have sales and marketing, which has applications built on AWS, OCI, the Oracle Cloud infrastructure that is, as well as Azure. And you see something similar across the others as well. Now, if you think about it, how do you make sure that any department application or any of these departments that are using these different pieces of infrastructure are actually using it in a secure manner? For example, if they're using AWS, how do you know that the EC2 keys have not been rotated, right, or have been rotated? How do you make sure that you have policies that basically capture that? If someone's using Azure and they actually have a virtual network, how do you make sure that there's no malicious changes that are happening on these in the configuration? Or how do you make sure that there is no internet gateway that's actually being posted as part of the virtual network out there, so somebody from the outside can get access? And obviously, one of the places where we've seen a lot of issues in terms of data breaches has been the S3 buckets in Amazon. Because of the heterogeneous infrastructure being used, as well as because of the shared responsibility model, it's quite possible that someone who doesn't know about securing S3 buckets has actually made something public as they built an application. Now, we've seen lots of breaches where such public S3 buckets have led to data leakages. Now, how do you ensure that that doesn't happen? And obviously, kind of going into a little more detail about the different login events, like in the case of someone having multiple failed OCI login attempts. So this is kind of where the whole CASB service can kind of play a role. As you can imagine, these are multiple different various different infrastructures. They have different resources. In one case, it's about looking at EC2 keys. The other, it's about looking at the network. In another instance, it's about storage, and then obviously the kind of behavior. So that's where Oracle CASB kind of steps in. We have some built-in smart policies, as I mentioned, for each of these infrastructures. And what we typically do is we look at the different policies, we capture any deviations from those policies, and we alert information security, or we generate alerts that can then be actioned upon, whether it's through InfoSec or it is through some kind of service management tool. And we'll talk about the different integrations as we get later into the presentation as well. The second use case is about meeting consistent governance. So essentially, governance standards, if you will. Again, when you have multiple different infrastructures being used, the actual need for things like storing specific logs for a particular duration does not go away, because some of these are basically driven by compliance needs. And that's one other place where we can go. And we've actually seen this with a few customers where they say that their different logs coming in from, say, AWS and OCI as well as Azure need to be stored for a particular window of time. So for example, they need to be stored for 2 weeks. Now, how do you make sure that, in order to make sure that this happens across different vendors, the challenge is that you actually need to understand what are the different services that actually produce these logs, and how are the configurations for those services actually set. And that's really one other place where the Oracle CASB service kind of comes in and says, well, here's one place you can actually set it, and this kind of gets applied across different infrastructures. The third use case is looking at leaky data storage, as we mentioned, right? This could be across different infrastructure vendors. So one of the things that we look at is, are there any S3 buckets? Are there object storage instances that are available? And how are these configured? In case these configurations tend to be insecure, we can actually raise different alerts that either the IT department or the InfoSec department can actually action upon. So obviously, this kind of solves the issues that a lot of customers have had with, say, something like S3 bucket leakages. And finally, in terms of the admin usage that's being abused, right? So basically, that's where user and entity behavior analytics kind of kicks in. So in this instance, as I mentioned, as and when users look at these different applications, we build a baseline of behavior for those users. Just to give you a simple example, if someone has basically instantiating a GPU instance in your compute, now if they've never done that before, well, we've seen a lot of few instances where customers have basically landed up with a huge bill from the infrastructure provider, basically because someone kicked off a GPU instance and it was used for, say, something like Bitcoin mining. So what we do is when we see anomalous behavior like that, that kind of is a deviation from the user's baseline, immediately we raise alerts that can then be captured and can be actioned upon, right? So very important, particularly when you think about a very large scale, deployments, and particularly where they have very different applications on the cloud that are being leveraged, and which is almost most organizations today, where you cannot basically leave this to the eyes of the security operations team to go through manual logs and the kind. It is almost imperative that you need to look at things like machine learning and user and entity behavior analytics, which is essentially what we use as part of the Oracle CASB solution here. And in terms of kind of summarizing what we actually support for each of the infrastructures, there's the support for OCI services across the board. We basically support compute, network storage, as well as identity and access management services. And as I mentioned, there's a policy engine where we look at out-of-the-box smart policies that we ship, with which you can actually ensure that there's a consistent security posture. And there's obviously things around security and governance that we provide, which is looking at the different actions on the compute instances or the network instances and looking at the login behavior across these different services that users may be using. And as I mentioned, across the board, there's behavior analytics included as well. For AWS, we have pretty comprehensive support. We support all the services, things like EC2, S3, VPC, and the list goes on. We actually have more than 3 dozen out-of-the-box policies. So the knowledge that each of our customers need around securing AWS is actually definitely reduced in terms of the domain knowledge and the application, the service knowledge, because out of our experience, we provide a bunch of out-of-the-box policies, and these policies kind of help customers get a secure posture to start with. And obviously, the different things that we look at, things like tagging of EC2 instances. Someone's actually created an instance that's in production versus in development, and can then look at how do you prevent somebody from bringing down a production instance if they're not supposed to, right? So things like that. And one of the things from a compliance governance perspective, we actually have a report that provides complete support for the CIS framework. And that is something that is also in the works for the other infrastructure providers that actually for which those standards exist today. The third one, of course, is the Azure, Microsoft Azure. Here again, we support all the major services around virtual machines, virtual networks, storage, AD, as well as disk and key vault. And very similar to what we do with OCI as well as with AWS, we actually provide monitoring, visibility, and integration capabilities with various SIEM solutions. We provide for security and governance things, things that like looking for activities around the compute instance, for network instances, and so on. And across the board, there's behavior analytics as well. If you look at the key differentiators, I think one of the biggest differentiators that we actually have is the breadth and the depth of functionality that we provide across all the cloud services. We're not restricted to just one of these or two of these. We also support pretty much across the board that look at Azure as well as AWS. And in addition to that, we're the only one today in the market that actually supports OCI. And we've seen customers who actually started to adopt this, and it's driven mostly by the use cases that most of these customers have asked for. The big difference that Gartner, for example, points out is the fact that we probably have the best UEBA solution in the market today, right, amongst the CASB vendors. And we provide the user and entity behavior analytics for privileged accounts along with associated risk scores. So if someone's using a particular application, we just look at what the past behavior is. Based on that, we actually generate a risk score, and essentially that risk score can be used to make any decisions that you want. The third big differentiator is around the out-of-the-box smart policies that I mentioned. These definitely enhance the speed with which you can go to market. For example, with the out-of-the-box policies, you can kind of look at the typical security posture that you need for the different infrastructure. For example, with AWS, as I mentioned, there are about 3 dozen different policies that we ship out of the box. This kind of looks for the most obvious things that customers have faced in the past, and this is kind of best practices that we've developed with, say, hundreds of hours of effort within our teams itself, right? The fourth big difference is the fact that we don't just look at securing the infrastructure, we actually look at securing the value chain that's associated with the infrastructure. For example, we also provide security for tools like GitHub and Slack. Let's move into what the Cloud Access Security Broker can do for SaaS applications. as you can imagine, we fit the same set of kind of similar challenges that customers actually face with securing SaaS, right? We've seen customers talk about the shared responsibility model, who's responsible for what, and how exactly do they put that in place. And obviously, in the case of SaaS, there are thousands of applications that typically get used. And there's the compliance requirements. Obviously, that's not going away. It's sometimes vertical specific. In other cases, it's region specific. And customers also are worried about data leakage. As you can imagine, when you start using cloud services, your data is actually getting stored in the cloud. If that is the case, you really need to wonder about who has access to that data and how is that actually being utilized. So we'll talk about what is it that a CASB can actually do for that specific challenge. Then there's the misuse of admin privileges. We'll talk about what can possibly happen when somebody misuses administrative privileges on, say, a SaaS application, which is kind of very different from the regular on-premises applications that we've seen. And obviously, there's the risk associated with shadow IT applications. And these are, applications, cloud, applications that are used by users which are not sanctioned by IT, but are being used behind the scenes, which, you need to know about, or you need to ensure that the data there is actually secure. Very similar to what we did with infrastructure as a service, let's look at what the shared responsibility model here is going to look like. For example, multiple departments, each using their own SaaS services. Let's take someone who's using Salesforce. What happens if someone is actually requesting a mass data delete on Salesforce, for example? Now, you would want to know about it, but again, the Salesforce admin may actually be sitting inside the sales department, and they may actually have someone who's their own administrator for that application, and you would want to know if that's basically going to impact your security posture. What if someone has, let's say you have customers, and we've seen this in a few instances in the recent past, where customers who adopted HCM Cloud, somebody goes in and changes the role of a particular user in HCM Cloud. Do you want to be notified of it? How do you do some active monitoring around those applications? Then there's situations like some privilege escalation, say for example in ServiceNow, or failed GitHub login attempts. These are, as you can imagine, each of these requires specific knowledge of those applications, and you need to know what are the different configurations that need to be set. And that's what we try to simplify using the Oracle CASB Cloud Service, which is we look at taking away some of these complexities and abstracting those and applying those from within the CASB Cloud Service, so you can look at actually utilizing and leveraging these in a secure manner, right? And all of these, obviously, we'll look at how these meet compliance needs as well. When it comes to compliance, I'll give you a simple example. What happens when some user goes in and tries to change the role or escalate privileges for themselves in, say, something like ServiceNow? Now, when this happens, you would probably want to know, depending on what kind of privilege escalation happens, you would probably want to know and also want to find out if there's any segregation of duties that may happen or any risk from a security perspective that may actually happen as a result. That's really where one of the things that Oracle CASB service can do is, because it's heterogeneous in nature, it can look at different applications on the cloud. It basically can raise an alert and say, here's something that you should be worried about, and you can take some actions based on that. The second one is sensitive data leak. As I mentioned, what happens if somebody goes in and clones an admin user on Salesforce? Now, again, something that may lead to some kind of data leakage later from a very critical application. However, you would still want to be aware of it, take any remedial action up front if necessary, and so on. The third use case that I mentioned was around the misuse of admin privileges. I'll give you a simple example, and we've seen this happen with a few of our customers, where let's say that you actually have a HR business partner, for example, right, who on a normal basis makes, say, about 5 salary changes per day, and we know that as baseline behavior based on our UEBA capabilities. All of a sudden, this user goes in and makes about 10 different changes in a particular day. That is abnormal activity. Because it's abnormal activity, the CASB service and its UEBA capabilities and the machine learning capabilities captures that and immediately sends out an alert, which can be, on which you can take some action. Now, here's the interesting thing. This is an administrative privilege that a HR business partner has. It's something that they're allowed to do, but they're going beyond their typical business needs, for example, or doing something different. And that's really what we're trying to capture. And obviously, the fifth challenge that we've seen, the use case we've seen, is around looking at stealth and shadow IT. A lot of organizations have gone and they have signed up with multiple cloud providers, say, for example, for storing data and for CRM solutions and the kind. It's quite possible that some employees within the organization may start using applications on their own. For example, if an organization has signed up with Box as a collaboration solution, and some of the users are going in behind the backs and basically using Dropbox, you would still want to find out. You would want to bring them into the fold and actually encourage them to use the one that you've actually signed up for, as opposed to just going in and using a rogue application. And that's really where a CASB can help. What we do is we can actually inject the logs from various different parsers, from various different firewalls using the universal parser that we have. And this kind of gives you a clear picture of what different applications are being used. We have the largest app risk registry, which basically looks at the risks associated with these different applications and the kind. And with that, we generate an application risk score. And obviously there's machine learning involved in that. And this looks at various patterns of behavior and the kind. And that's what we actually present as part of our of the CASB service, because now you know what applications are being used, the risk level of those applications, which of those are sanctioned versus which of those are shadow or stealth, and how do you bring them back into the fold of sanctioned infrastructure or sanctioned applications. So this is one of the this is another very common use case that we've actually seen from many of our customers. And let's talk about what we actually do for each of these SaaS applications. So let's take the Oracle applications, in this case the HCM Cloud services. We look at pretty much across all the modules in HCM Cloud. We look at any role changes that may happen, and we also monitor the privileged accounts. So the key here is the active monitoring that we actually do across these applications. So things around PII that may have changed on HCM Cloud, or the salary information that may have changed. These are things that we basically observe. We raise alerts for, particularly if these are abnormal behavior that we actually notice for that particular user. The key is CASB provides, and this is something we've heard from a few of our customers repeatedly, is the capability to actively monitor these applications for any of these critical changes that may happen. And obviously, because we are well integrated with multiple different solutions, we actually have integration with SIM solutions into which we can actually push all these alerts and you can take action. And in order to deliver this particular service, we actually use the HCM API. So it's kind of, no real installs involved in the kind. So basically, we actually provide this as by leveraging the APIs behind the scenes. And we support about 16 different resources within the HCM Cloud itself, and for different actions that may be performed on those resources, and use that for threat modeling. Now, the other one is the ERP Cloud services. Here we actually look at the role management changes that may happen in the privileged accounts as well. And this is what we monitor for changes for. And as and when something changes here, we kind of move it back. And as in the case of HCM Cloud, we also use the API, and hence there's really no install that's actually used. And as I mentioned, as we did for the AWS solution for infrastructure, here as well, we actually provide out-of-the-box policies both for ERP Cloud as well as for HCM Cloud. And this kind of helps you get to a consistent security posture right out of the box. One of the most used applications that we've actually seen today is around Office 365. And this is an interesting one. It's also a very heavily deployed one. The key is, how do you secure the very different applications that come with Office 365 services? For example, customers may be using Exchange around email. They may be using SharePoint and OneDrive, or it could also be the Azure Active Directory that they have. Now, one of the things that we've done is we've integrated with the Office API, and very similar to what we've done with the other services, we actually have out-of-the-box policies. And this gets pretty complex and comprehensive when it comes to Office 365, because out of the box, you want to be able to get a consistent security posture for O365 as well. For example, you want to make sure that none of the SharePoint folders or drives are actually open to public. You want to make sure that OneDrive or files stored in OneDrive are not really, how are they being shared and the kind. So these are all the kind of capabilities that we actually provide. And as in the case of the HCM Cloud as well, here also we provide a bunch of different policies out of the box, protecting more than 100 resources, and we use that for threat modeling. So this is something that we provide as a very important service from our customers who are using Office 365. One of the other things we also do is what we call the smart config capability for Office 365, which is anytime configuration changes actually happen for any of the O365 services, we actually notify users. And that is a very critical capability, particularly when you look at distributed environments for O365, because different people may be making changes at different points. You still want to be notified if there are any configuration changes that may impact your security posture. And we'll get a little bit into data protection in a bit, but when it comes to SharePoint and OneDrive, we actually look at classification of data that's there and look at data leaks that we can actually detect in the process. From a Salesforce perspective, we broadly support the Salesforce.com application as well as the App Exchange, because you could literally have different apps that are running on the Salesforce platform that may still have access and that may actually need some kind of active monitoring. And that's really what we actually support today. And based on these, we actually look at various different monitoring capabilities, specifically around risk factors, for example, mass deletes per day, any changes in configuration and the kind. And as and when we detect something that's anomalous, we actually, as we do in most of the other cases, we raise alerts, we send out, we basically, we can integrate with the SIM solutions and so on. And when it comes to ServiceNow, as you can imagine, it's a pretty well-used service management solution. We do have multiple different resources that we look at protecting using our policy engine. And this is also, as in the case of other solutions, used for threat modeling. We have out-of-the-box reports for all of these, and we also have what we call as key security indicators, which is things like how many failed logins happened, which of these have unchanged passwords, for example, or unused accounts and the kind. So these are different things that we can actually provide for different SaaS applications. Some of the key differentiators, as I mentioned, upfront, we actually support the Oracle SaaS applications. In fact, we are the only CASB in the market today that can actually support the Oracle SaaS applications, things like HCM Cloud, ERP Cloud, CX, and so on. The second thing is, and this is something that we've seen many of our customers actually talk about, which is the fastest time to value, particularly given that we have the smart policies and the smart config capabilities. And we also use a lot of the UEBA capabilities across the entirety of the enterprise SaaS applications. It's extremely significant in terms of the value that we deliver, as well as the time being extremely short. So that's one of the big differentiators that we bring to bear. And in terms of the deployment itself, we've seen many instances where we are up and running for really large deployments literally within days, right? So they start small, but they literally have covered pretty much a good chunk of the enterprise, hundreds of thousands of users within days. So in terms of time to value, it's really quick. And fourth, of course, and Gartner mentioned this in one of the reports, we have the largest app risk registry, particularly when you think about people who are using different applications. SaaS applications, there's going to be multiple different applications used by each of the departments. So obviously you want to make sure that you get the right level of risk associated with each of those applications. And that's where we have the largest app risk registry, which helps us detect or determine the risk associated with the different shadow and stealth applications that are being used. Now, quickly, let's go into the CASB for data protection piece. So essentially, if you think about it, there are three broad challenges that we look at, into helping enterprises with. One is what kind of data is actually stored in the cloud, because this is one of the biggest security challenges that we've heard from many customers, right? Yes, I'd love to adopt the cloud for all the benefits it gives me, but I'm also worried about how do I protect my sensitive data there. So we'll talk about some of the ways that we can actually help there. The second is around ensuring that any of the sensitive content that's out there does not go to unauthorized users. It's not just knowing what's in the cloud application, but it's also making sure that it doesn't get shared with multiple different people. The third is around making sure that you have the right compliance requirements that you meet and so on, specifically around data. So look at the first one. The first is, you may have multiple different documents that may be stored in, say, services like OneDrive or SharePoint or Box. How do you know what kind of data is actually being stored there? So one of the things we do is we actually integrate with more than 50 different data dictionaries. And as soon as you set up the service, we can actually go in, we can look at classifying data that exists, pre-existing data on each of these services. And obviously when a user logs in using, say, something like IDCS or the Identity Cloud service that Oracle provides as a single sign-on capability, we know who the users are, and literally on demand, when the user actually uploads the file, we can look at what kind of data is actually in the file. Does it contain PII, PCI, or HIPAA kind of data? And if it is, we can actually, based on the rules that you set, we can classify these documents as being sensitive or confidential and so on. And in case you find that there's certain pieces of data that should not exist, we can actually remediate that, that piece of data. For example, if a document contains, highly sensitive HIPAA information that's not supposed to be there, your rules can capture that. And as soon as it captures it, it can actually either delete it or quarantine that particular document. So it's something which I think has been a lot of different needs that we've seen from our customers specifically for this. And as I mentioned, we actually look at, we integrate with 50 different data dictionaries. We actually have multiple different data dictionaries we support. This gives us pretty comprehensive support in terms of identifying the data and classifying the data, particularly things like personally identifiable information, maybe addresses of users, first names, last names across different regions as well. So this is pretty comprehensive in its coverage. The second is, how do you ensure that this sensitive data is not going to unauthorized users or to unauthorized places? So for example, you could have a user who's logging in from within your organization, within say a network that you've detected. And it may be perfectly okay for them to access Box or data that's actually stored in say something like Box. However, if the user is trying to log in from a completely different location, you can actually set in rules which say under those circumstances, the same user, although valid, should not be allowed to do certain things. For example, it could be valid actions like download, preview, edit of these documents, but given that we don't trust the location from which the user is coming, we can actually prevent that from happening. And this kind of helps prevent oversharing of sensitive documents as well. Obviously, there's some prerequisites around it, but we can, we'll look at how exactly should these be integrated, should it be with what kind of standards like SAML, for example, that we need to adhere to. The third use cases around, that we've seen is kind of determining the risk associated with the data that's stored. So on the one hand, we look at the kind of data that you actually have. The second, on the other hand, we also look at the risk associated with that data. And this is where aspects of machine learning kind of kick in, because you can basically look at what kind of data is there, how much of it is actually shared, how often is it exposed or accessed, and you can kind of quantify the data exposure risk as a result. And that's what the data navigator actually helps you do, which is across the different resources, it gives you a clear view of the different pieces of data that are stored and what kind of risk is associated with those. Obviously, this kind of brings us to the last part, which is around, the platform features and the enterprise integrations that we actually provide. As I mentioned up front, we actually provide integrations with specific different applications, and we also provide access to our own application in using different personas or roles. One of the things that we actually introduced recently is the ability to actually have some privacy associated with the CASB console, because although CASB is used in a SOC, for example, you don't want the SOC operator to actually look at specific pieces of PII within the applications. That's why we actually introduced the SOC operator admin role recently, which basically makes sure that the SOC operators do not have access to PII, and they basically get access to only the data that they need to in order to make sure that they can make sense of the different events that they see coming their way. The regular admins obviously retain full access, but as a SOC admin, you basically look at just the incidents that are created essentially for the operator there. And obviously that means that things like email addresses and other things, usernames and stuff like that, are not shown when somebody logs in with the SOC operator role. The second thing that we spoke about, again, this was something that I mentioned, which is the different integrations that we have. For example, with SIM vendors, we integrate with pretty much any SIM vendor at this point, whether it's folks like Splunk and Curator or our own Oracle SMA solution on the cloud. And we have out-of-the-box integrations for all of these, and the risk events essentially go to the SIM for reporting completeness, and you could also leverage the CASB API in terms of pulling out the risk events. And finally, in terms of identity provider integrations, as I mentioned, we focus on being or thrive on being an extremely heterogeneous solution with best-in-class support for the various applications from Oracle. That in mind, we actually have integrations with our own identity cloud service. We also integrate with solutions like Okta and Ping Identity for an identity provider perspective. So obviously, this kind of gives complete access for users into data into the enterprise cloud applications, and we also provide identity provider SSO capabilities into the CASB console itself. And obviously, this means that you can actually have some automated remediation capabilities or things like suspending risky users and the kind that you can actually bring to bear. Thank you very much for your attention today. If we can be of any help, please let us know. Feel free to reach out to us. More information can also be found cloud.oracle.com, and all the documentation is also available online. Thank you.